Alright, so first of all, to start off with line charts, and line charts are very similar to bar charts in the sense that they are also used to represent some kind of values on the y-axis and some kind of category on the x-axis. But this time the category is not exactly a categorical value like we looked at yesterday. It's not exactly a value like a category, a segment, a subcategory, but rather it's a time series. On the x-axis you have a time series, and on the y-axis you have the values. That's my line chart. And you can see the options are exactly the same as what we had for bar charts. Only difference is the color saturation is missing. So you can't exactly set color saturations here. Otherwise, the concept is exactly the same. I'll take sales and put it on values. I'll take order date and put it on axis. And we will get just as we expected here. Okay, and just this is something we talked about yesterday at it was the fag end of the session. We talked about hierarchies in detail, and we learned that whenever you have any kind of date fields will be automatically treated, and it will be treated as a hierarchy by default. Okay, and you can see by default we're displaying data at the level of detail of year. And there goes my line chart. And if I want to expand it, I can absolutely click on this expand all down, and you can see how we can expand it to year and quarter. You can expand it further down to year, quarter, month, and finally to the most granular level of day. The options here are going to be very similar. Export data, show data, spotlight. We talked about these pieces, and this is the drill down feature will be very similar to what we talked about yesterday when we discussed bar charts. You can turn on the drill down option, and the management sees that in 2015 there's been a big dip and is the lowest sales. You want to know what happened in 2015. With the drill down turned on, just click on it and look at all the quarters of 2015, and you want to look at April. I want to look at April 2015, all the months of that quarter. And finally, you want to look at May 2015, all the days of May 2015, starting right from May 1 to May 31st. Okay, so this is how you can apply the drill down feature. Coming back to the specifics of the line chart, the legend again will behave very similar to how legends behave for bar charts. So remember in bar chart, basically at the default level, we can display one bar. But if I have to divide that one single bar into multiple sub bars, the concept is very similar. Right now we're displaying one line basically, but if I want to have multiple lines for multiple segments, we can just take that segment and drag and drop it onto legends and see how the different segments will have different lines here. Okay, very clearly you can see consumer is the winner. Consumer is way ahead of corporate and home office in terms of aggregate sales. In fact, it's double the overall. Okay, so and again, if you expand it, these options will be very, very similar. Tooltips will behave the exact same way. If you hover over a particular point, you can see that the details right now for the date and the segment and sales values. But if you want to, let's say, also know the profit values, you can just drag and drop it specifically here, and you can see the profit values as well here. Okay. So this is again just as we have learned yesterday for bar charts. The filter options I'm not going to repeat again. This is going to be exactly the same, coming straight to the formatting options. And again, general will remain the same. Legend is the same property. X-axis, Y-axis, all the same properties here. X-axis will be a little different because here X-axis is basically a date type. So X-axis will be slightly different, but conceptually it's going to be very similar. Like it's just the only difference will be you can actually set your in your start and end points. You can actually set calendar. Okay, this is just to set the axis of the scales, and other things will be very, very similar. Titles, grid lines, data colors. You can set your data colors for legends, again exactly the same as what we talked about for bar chart. Data labels, again very similar to what we talked about for bar charts. You need to be very careful, by the way, when you turn on data labels for line charts, because especially when you look at a chart like this where it's very granular data that you're looking at. I mean, up to quarter level it says okay. I think data labels make sense here, but the moment you look at month level of detail, you need to be very, very careful because it looks very congested. Okay. So again, the properties that you can set here can be very similar. There's no difference as such. Exactly the same kind of properties that you can set here. And by the way, there's another very nice property here, just as I talked about just a while back, where I said you need to be very careful when you have very, very detailed data or very granular data. You need to be very careful and cautious while using labels, because there's a very high probability that your labels might overlap each other, which is actually happening, but you can actually increase your label density to show all the points. Very neat option, label density. If you make it 0, obviously you will not see any labels, but 100 means basically you will see all labels. You may not appreciate it for months here, but the moment you go to day level, see what happens. So Power BI tries to display all the labels for you, or at least it tries to. It's not really successful doing it, but it tries to display all the labels. You see how the overlaps are happening. See how it tries to display all your labels here. You might want to reduce the text size here just to add a bit, but you can see it tries to display all your labels. Label density is 100%. Okay, so that's just an important concept I wanted to highlight here. Other than that, the options are very similar. And finally, the only other thing that you have here, plot area, the same options we discussed yesterday. And only other thing is something called shapes. Shapes is the part where you can specifically customize each line and their respective intersection shapes. You can see that by default, it's a round. The joint type is actually a round, but you can actually change it to a meter or a bevel. Okay, so this is just an intersection point that you can actually highlight here. And you can absolutely choose your stroke width, make the lines very, very thick, or you can also change the overall style of the line. Dashed, dotted, or solid. Okay, if you're not happy with setting all the line properties at once, you can absolutely go ahead and specifically customize the properties for each line. You can turn on the customize option here, and now you can look at the consumer, corporate, and home office. You can specifically set these values. So for consumer, you want the stroke width to be very, very high. You really want to highlight consumer, and everything else. So consumer, you're going to increase that stroke width, let's say, and everything else you can just go ahead and make it dotted and just kind of fade them onto the background. Okay, so that is how, just some examples on how you can configure it. Okay, you can see you're very clearly communicating the story about the consumer. I think it's just too dark, it looks. Okay, maybe want to change it. Okay, and specifically here you can also change the colors to add that extra bit of, okay, consumer might want to make it a slightly darker shade. Okay, so that's about line charts, guys. Similar to line charts, you also have something called area charts. Area charts are very, very similar to line charts. The only difference is that area charts, unlike line charts, where you're just going to go back and revert first thing, just revert to default on all these properties. See how the yellow thing comes up whenever you change any options. You can absolutely just click on that yellow revert to default again, just to revert the entire visualization to its default properties. Okay, now we're back to the default visual right now. This is what we initially had. Now, as you can see here, I'm going to go back to quarter just to show a little more aggregated level of detail. Now, this is the area chart. The line chart is very similar to the area chart. The only difference is that in the area chart, instead of drawing the lines, here also you draw the lines, but the only difference is that you basically shade the area below the lines. Okay, you can see what we are doing here. So above you have the line chart, and below you have the area chart. The area chart is also composed of lines. As you can very clearly see, the trends are very similar. Actually, it's exactly the same, but the only difference in area chart, you're shading the area below the lines. Now, you might be wondering why is this important, and I think it's just more of a choice that you have, especially which kind of visual you need to go for. Area charts are very useful if you want to compare differences, and if you want a more intuitive understanding of what your trends are. And as an example, what I want to do here is an example. And you can see the options also are very, very similar. Access, legend, values, tooltips. And even if you go to the formatting options, formatting pane, the exact same options that you had in line charts. So area charts and line charts are exact replicas of each other. Only difference is the use case. When do you use which one? Okay. And to discuss that use case, I'm going to take an example here. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create a simple column called cost. Now we have all learned how to create columns. I can create that in DAX, but I'm going to do it the way we all understand how to do it. So I'm going to head over to edit queries and add a quick column here, custom column. And I'm going to call my custom column cost. And the cost column is going to be equal to my sales. And it's going to subtract it my profit. Okay, very, very simple calculation. So sales minus profit is my cost. There goes my cost column. I will quickly change my data type here and close and apply this whole thing. Okay. Now in my model, a new column called cost would be applied. Remember, it's 1.2. That is, it's a decimal type, and aggregation is by default set to a sum. Now, what I want to do here is I want to compare my give me a second here. Not sure I'm not able to click here. All right. Anyways, I'm not able to click here on the title bar. Anyways, that's not important right now. Okay. So let's proceed. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to look at my sales and my cost. And again, I'm going to look at this as a line chart. We already learned this, but this is slightly different. The way I'm going to develop it is going to be slightly different. Now what I'm doing is instead of representing or instead of displaying one value, I'm actually displaying two values. Now that is something that you can do absolutely in Power BI. You can absolutely do that. Especially for line charts, you can absolutely do that kind of a thing. You can see I'm representing my sales and cost as the lines. So the blue is the sales line, the black is the cost line. All the other properties will be exactly the same, but here instead of data color, so the legend, you can actually change the color of your sales and costs, right? So let's say the question that you're trying to answer here. Obviously, the line chart gives you a very good intuitive understanding of what are the trends of your sales and cost for the company. But let's say the question that you're asking is something very different. The question that you're asking is, uh, what are my profits? I mean, yes, I mean, in this case, obviously we had a profit column. So you might ask me like, okay, hey, let's just plot a line chart for profit. So absolutely, you can do that. But what if in your data set or in data model you do not have a profit? And let's say you don't really want to represent that information as a separate chart because the whole idea of visualization is to optimize space and to convey the maximum information in the least amount of space, right? That's the overall objective. And this chart gives me a great understanding of the sales and the profit trends, sales and the cost trends, but it somehow fails to give me a clear picture of my profit trends. Now, conceptually, what is my profit? My profit is basically my profit is defined as sales minus cost, right? So how much revenues you made minus how much cost you incurred. If you subtract them, you basically get your profit. But the subtraction operation is kind of pretty complicated in a line chart because uh, I mean, if you look at it again, how the human eye perceives data, human eye is not very good. We are not that good in interpreting areas, right? So we are very very good in measuring bars, measuring lengths, but we are not very good in areas. So uh, you can see that here. I have to basically make an approximation of what that profit is. And further, if you go down to a slightly more granular level of month, you can see again, yes, I mean, you do get, I mean, if you look at this whole thing in isolation, you do get an idea that, okay, yes, my profit has increased, my profit has decreased. It's not that evident. You have to focus, I mean, you have to spend some time, look at the values, approximate the values, and then you can go back and answer the question, okay, my profit is actually $12,000 here. Okay. However, if I convert this whole thing to area chart, and I'm just going to take that replica below that, you can see that the whole process becomes far more intuitive here. So here, I'm going to make a small change right now. So the colors, I'm going to just go ahead and make it a dark black because the idea is to have that contrast. And now you can see that this conveys a very, very different picture. So the question you're answering here, or rather I'll keep a red, this kind of brings the contrast. The question you're answering here is very different. The solution you're proposing here is very different. And remember, they're both fundamentally they're the same things, right? So above is my line chart, below is my area chart. They're fundamentally the same things, but the only difference is that the question of the profit can be better answered by the area chart below compared to the line chart above. Okay, because you can just see the trends. You can just see that area. So what is my profit? My profit is basically the green area. Okay, my profit is that green area. The red area is basically my cost. The green and the red area combined is my sales because see they're overlapping actually. Sales is actually higher than your cost everywhere. And only that small green area is my profit. And you get a very, very good intuitive feel of how your profits have increased, how your profits have decreased. You can very clearly see that how in this particular month, February 2015, how your profits actually increased despite having faced a poor year just a month before that. Okay, so you get a very good intuitive feel, and you can see roughly how it has trended. Okay, so that is one use case of an area chart. Of course, similar to area charts, you also have something. This is basically a area chart, normal area chart, but similar to this, you also have something called a stacked area chart. And all it does is very similar. Again, conceptually, it is very similar. Keep an eye out on the axis here. Keep an eye out on the axis, all of you. Right now you can see the axis is 0 to 120,000. Stacked area chart, obviously the axis will increase because as the name implies, in stacked area chart, you're basically stacking one above the other. Okay, so this is not a very good use case for this. Typically, when you do stacked area chart, sales and cost is not a very good thing to take. So now I'm going to slightly replace my so sales and cost was an excellent candidate for this kind of a chart, the normal area chart. But for stacked area charts, we'll head back to the usual kind of visualization where here I'm going to take my legend as, let's say, segments. Okay, this is a very good use case. So I'm going to just click on segments, and here I'm going to do the same thing. Just take segments. Okay, and make it a stacked area chart. Okay, see, this is also a very good chart, but then the problem is this doesn't really convey. But here, because if you're really looking to analyze individual trends across different segments, you're better off with a line chart than an area chart, because you can see how it is overlapping, and it really doesn't convey a whole lot of information to you. These overlaps mean nothing, but then a stacked area chart will be a better visualization because you can see the total. That means you can see the total sales, and yet you can also see how each sales has stacked on top of each other. Now, in other words, let me put it this way. This, what you're looking at here, is very similar to a stacked column chart. Now, again, they're not, it doesn't mean that it's a stacked column chart. A stacked column chart is something completely different, but conceptually, it is very similar to a stacked column chart. Okay, so, sorry, I'm just going to click on that visual. And if I make it a stacked column chart, you can see conceptually, they're very similar. Okay, conceptually, they're very, very similar. So right now, it is actually sorted. I'm going to go ahead and sort it by year, quarter, month. Do ascending sort, and here it goes. You can see conceptually they're very similar, although bar charts are column charts. We should never use column charts to represent time series data, but you can just to highlight conceptually what a stacked area chart means. Stacked area chart is exactly the same as a stacked bar chart or a stacked column chart, but the only difference is instead of the bars you have the points, and you're joining the points with areas. Okay, I hope all of you can visualize this whole thing. So you can see that red area coming up on top. See how it's stacked on top of each other. See that big shade of red coming up here. See how that red, and see how that red is coming up here. So they're very, very similar. And just as we have learned about the merits and demerits of the stacked, the same thing applies here for the stacked area chart also. It's great to compare proportions. It's really good to understand the overall sales, because you can see that the topmost line conveys the overall sales, the total sales. Okay, but if you want to compare across different, I think that is not good. So if you want to compare this with this, you cannot use the stacked area chart because it is stacked on top of each other. I would rather get back to my normal area chart, or rather the line chart, to make that kind of a comparison. Okay, and again, as I talked about, this is very similar, and as you can see, the options are going to be exactly the same with no difference at all. Okay, so that's about my area charts and line charts for all of you. Next up, I'm going to talk about two other kinds of charts, and I'm just going to complete this part so that you can together go and do a quick round of practice. So this is basically a combination chart. So far we have discussed about a column chart and a line chart, and the combination chart is nothing but a combination of the two. So this is basically a line and stacked column, whereas this is a line and clustered column. So let me start off with a line and clustered column. And you can see the options here are very similar to what we have learned in column charts yesterday and what we have learned in line charts today. So first up, we have the shared axis. Remember, this is a combination of a bar and a line, or rather a column and a line. So the x-axis is basically going to be the shared axis. So typically, again, here also we represent time series data. Usually, I will take my shared axis as my order date. See how order date hierarchy will be automatically created because it's date time. Column values is basically the values for the column chart. It will be sales. And line values will be the values for the line chart, which is, let's say, going to be profit, or let's say cost. Okay, so column values is the values for the column chart, whereas line values are the values for the line chart. Very similar to what we have learned about today. And the only other difference here is the column series. This is like the column legend. So if I just take a normal column chart, so the legend part that you have here is what we denote using the column series here. Okay, so you're just seeing the individual bars right now. What if you want to see the subdivision across different segments? You can just take that segment and put it across column series. And because it is a clustered column chart, you can see that each of those bars will be subdivided into 3 side-by-side bars, sub-bars, so to say. Okay. You might be asking me, okay, why can't I do a line series? Just like you can do a column series, why can't I have a line series? That's a limitation that you have in combination charts. You can only have only one kind of series. You can't have two types of series. Okay. So if you want to have a series breakdown based on cost, you can just swap your cost to column values and your sales to line values. You just take your cost here. You can just go ahead and take your cost here, whereas you can put your sales here if you want to do that kind of a comparison. Okay. And tooltips will work the exact same way. You can see this is, and hierarchy options and other things will work the exact same way. Coming to the formatting options, everything else will be very, very similar. There's no difference. One important difference I do want to highlight here on the y-axis. This is the important part. Remember, here we are using two types of axis. So all of you can observe this. Left hand side, I have one type of axis. Remember, left hand side axis is pertaining to sales, and right hand side axis is pertaining to profit or cost. If you want to specifically select that, you can see that this is say something called show secondary. The show secondary is turned on. If you turn it off, there'll be no secondary axis. Both will be represented based on the same axis. Okay, there'll be no secondary axis in that case. Okay. So I can absolutely turn it on, or you can turn it off, as we talked about. So this depends on your use case, how you want to configure it. Typically, you should always turn it on, and you also have an option to align 0. Now, let me just take you through one simple use case, why it is so important, and I'm just going to go to a replica of this particular kind of chart, put it here. Now, what I'm going to do is, instead of taking the cost, let me go ahead and take something called a discount. Let me take a discount, and I just want to explain to you why having that particular option, and obviously discount the average discount. And you can see what we are representing here. And by the way, I'm just going to remove that segment. We all understand what the segment means. I'm just going to simply just remove the segment completely. And now you can see the bottom chart denotes the sales as the columns, and the line as the discount, average discount. And you can very clearly see there are two different kinds of axes that are created. Left hand side axis is basically pertaining to sales in millions. Right hand side axis is pertaining to average discounts in percentages. Now, again, remember in Power BI, the default axis setting and y-axis, if you see that here, show secondary is turned on. And I think now you will appreciate why it is so important, because the moment you turn it off, you can see what happens. When you turn it off, basically you're saying just create a shared axis for the y-axis, but that typically usually won't work out because your discount values are very, very less, right? They're two completely different scales you're comparing. The discount is basically the highest value will be 1. You can't have a more than 100% discount, right? So they're two very different scales, and the value of discount will never be more than 1. So obviously, you should always create a secondary scale for that. And there's one more option here to align the zeros. You can see how discount is starting from 1.54, but if you want to align with 0, you can actually do that. Okay, it will be more relevant if you do a slightly more. This is a uniform comparison, but again, if you want to specifically look at the trends, the increases, the decreases, you can actually turn this off. Okay, so that you're looking at it on a normalized scale. So that's all that we have here. There's no other difference, and y-axis, the other options are exactly what we have talked about, and other things are exactly the same as we have talked about. And remember, this is just a clustered. So the clustered and the line comparison, the clustered and stacked only matters when we actually choose something in the column series. I can take the segment in column series, and this is the clustered column chart. Whereas if I make this is going to be a stacked column chart. Everything else remains the same. Everything else remains the same. Only difference is that this column you're configuring as a stacked, whereas here you're configuring as a clustered. Okay, so that's about line charts, area charts, and combination charts for all of you. Next, we're going to be moving on to a ribbon chart. And so let's proceed and let's look at the next type of chart. The next type of chart is a very interesting kind of chart called ribbon charts. And again, ribbon charts are a fairly new inclusion in Power BI. And let's see how the ribbon charts look like. As you can see, this is the shell of a ribbon chart. This is what it looks like. And ribbon charts are basically a stacked column chart. That's exactly what they are. You can see ribbon chart. This is the ribbon chart. And look at these columns here. This is like a stacked column chart. These are stacked column charts. That's all that ribbon charts are. And the only difference in ribbon charts and stacked column chart is in ribbon charts, you're basically just putting an additional ribbon through all these individual stacks. That is the only difference. Otherwise, it is just exactly like a stack column chart. Okay. Now, obviously, you might be asking questions. Okay, then why do we have a ribbon chart? What's the big deal? So let me show you some use cases where a ribbon chart can tell you stories which a stack column chart cannot tell you. Okay. So first up, on top, I'll have a visualization to display my order date and order date by sales, and basically it's going to be my segment. There goes my stacked column chart. I'm going to display this up to the level of detail of quarter. Okay, so we already understand how to do this. So there's a small change I have to do. 2017 to basically I have to sort it in ascending order. There it goes. Things are perfect now. And below that, the exact same options. You can see the ribbon chart. The field section is exactly the same. There is no difference. Access, legends, values, and tooltips. Absolutely the same as a stacked column chart. I'll put the same values here also. I'll be looking at my sales and my values, order date in my access, segment in my legend. That's it. And you see the same hierarchy buttons will come up. And you can see that's my ribbon chart. Conceptually, what you're seeing up on top as a stack column chart and what you're seeing at the bottom, the ribbon chart, are exactly the same type of visuals. Okay. There are a few basic differences, by the way. A few basic differences are there. One of the differences is that in ribbon charts, you can see that it's always sorted. That is the topmost category. That is, remember, whether it is a stacked column chart. In a stacked column chart, typically you're stacking each of those subcategories on top of each other, right? And the order in which they are stacked is always going to be fixed, right? So it's depending on the order of your data here. First is consumer, then is corporate, then is home office. That is the basic order in which the stacks will be appearing, right? That's why you will always see the blue, then the black, then the red. That will always be fixed. It doesn't matter which one is lesser, which one is greater. So it will always be fixed. In ribbon chart, that is not the case. In ribbon chart, the first difference is that this will be based on descending order always. So the highest proportions will come up on top. The lowest proportions will come down. Very clearly, you can see the very first quarter, Q1 2014. I'm just going to go to expanded mode here. You can see home office was contributing the maximum proportion of the total sales, and that is why it came up on top. And then from there it dipped. So you can think of the first quarter like an abnormality, where home office was kind of the highest, whereas after that it dipped. Okay, so that's just one important thing to keep in mind, that it is always on the basis of the topmost proportion. That is clearly not the case here. If you go back to the column chart, it is not the case. Okay, and the other difference is obviously going to be that it just gives you a very good intuitive feel of your trends. Now remember, this is like a it's kind of a mix between a stacked column chart and a line chart. So although it doesn't look like a line chart or an area chart, but it kind of signifies that trend, because you can get a feel of how your overall consumer or how your corporate has actually increased. You can just get a feel of this data, right? So not only do you get a feel of the individual values, but you get a very good feel of how your overall consumer segment has actually increased, or how the trend has basically increased, or how the proportions have increased or decreased over a period of time. You get a very good idea of the overall trend. Okay, that is why we call it a overall mix between a stacked column chart and a line chart. And ribbon charts, the other options are very, very similar to what we have learned in column charts. There are a few differences rather, which I'll be quickly taking up here. The only additional thing that you have here is ribbons. Other things are exactly the same. The ribbons option, one thing you can absolutely set here is the spacing. The default is obviously 0, and that is how we should all maintain it, but you can absolutely change the spacing between the different ribbons. Personally, I find it, and as part of best practice also, this is kind of not recommended, because the idea is to ensure that they are seamlessly integrating with each other. And the other is something called match series color, which is how it typically should be. See, the series is basically blue, consumer is blue, corporate is black, home office is red. So the ribbons are going to match the series color, and typically that is how I should have it. But if you turn this off, you can see the ribbons will basically have their own color. Again, this kind of really takes there's no point in having a visualization like this, because the whole objective was to analyze trends, and you kind of lose that big picture the moment you do this. So you should always turn this on. And as I said, ribbon charts become very interesting to look at, especially if you go to detailed levels, like as you can see, I'm looking at year, quarter, month. So now you get to see some very interesting trends. You can see that Okay, home office started right from the, look at where home office was. Home office was here, Q1, and you can see how it has risen. There was a big jump here, then it again dipped back. So they can very clearly compare those months and those years where um, home office actually kind of came up in the top proportion. You can just over to the tooltip. The tooltip will also give you a very good idea of how um, the overall sales changed, what the rank was. You can just very clearly see 2015 quarter 4 November, the corporate rank was 2, whereas now the corporate rank is 3 and the changing rank is 1. Basically, the rank has actually dipped by 1. Okay, so you can get a very, very good idea of the trends. So you get this detailed level data and you get also a very good intuitive feel. And you can see that how you're getting an understanding of the proportions because it is a stack column chart, but you're also getting a very good idea of the trend of the proportions. Okay, look at those okay, by and large consumer, you can just take a look. Consumer by and large has been a very good performer, except for a few months where consumer has been a very bad performer. You can see some of these months where consumer has actually come at the last. And what does it mean when consumer comes here? What does it mean? It means that the rank of consumer is basically 3. So can consumer ranked the worst in terms of proportion of total sales. Okay, and some very interesting trends also happens here where you can see the consumer here ranks the worst. Probably the proportion here is like less than 25%, 20% of my total sales in this month. And the next month, it is actually more than 50%. So something would have happened between February and March. You get some interesting trends that way. Next up, we'll move on to something called a waterfall chart. Waterfall chart is another very, very interesting kind of chart, which is useful for giving us an idea of the um, breakdown in the overall cascading effect of data. Okay, very useful type of visual. And one important thing I do want to highlight, since I talked about line charts and bar charts already with you guys, and I've talked about trends with all of you, time series trends with all of you, especially for time series type of data, this is very, very useful. So whether I have a bar chart or I have a line chart, just below that I'll have a line chart. So I have a bar chart and I have a line chart here. And if you just right click on this particular bar, you can see how this particular bar has increased in 2017 quarter 4, how from the previous quarter there has been a drastic increase. And you want to know why that increase happened or how that increase happened, you can actually right click on that particular bar. And some of the other options we already talked about yesterday. One additional option that comes up, especially when you deal with time series data and x-axis, is an analyze option. Okay, and you can just go to analyze and say explain the increase, and automatically Power BI internally with the help of some machine learning algorithms will actually suggest to you how that increase happened. Some wonderful visuals it will automatically build. You can see we are comparing between Q3 and Q4. So this is where we are right now. So between quarter 3 and quarter 4 of 2017, a 42.7% increase happened. So big increase actually happened. And what you're trying to answer here is why that increase happened. So okay, the increase happened, we can all see that. But what you're more interested to understand is why that increase happened. And now what you're actually doing here is, okay, you can do different kinds of analysis. So this is just one thing Power BI is giving you where it says copiers, tables, and machines. Remember, there are all subcategories. What you're saying is copiers, tables, and machines accounted for the majority of your increase. So it is because of these subcategories that the majority of the increase happened. Of course, binders and accessories did decrease, but their decreases were kind of easily offset by the massive increases across these 3 subcategories. Okay, even storage for that matter. So this is the kind of waterfall chart that we can build. The objective behind showing you this to just to before I talk about waterfall, just to give you a big picture of where waterfall charts are already being used in Power BI, and we didn't have to do anything. There's absolutely no development involved. You just click a button and Power BI builds it automatically for you. Okay, of course, this is the other types of analysis you can absolutely do. Just go down, see a bunch of other waterfall charts that it has built. So depending on the kind of use case that you want to use, you can absolutely take it. You also have a scatter plot analysis here. You can also do finally, that's a ribbon chart that we just now talked about. Okay, so different ways in which you can analyze your data. This will also work on a line chart. So for instance, you see a massive increase in the overall trend in 2017 quarter 4, and you want to know how that increase happened. Right click on that, analyze, explain the increase. And not only for increase, it also works for decrease. So you can see a decrease happened here from the last quarter. So right click on it and say this time it will say explain the decrease. Automatically it will understand that a decrease happened, and it will automatically give you analysis and why the decrease happened. And so remember, once again, Power BI, it's not that intelligent to understand what results are right, what results are not relevant. So for instance, here it is saying there are particularly 3 customers that contributed to the largest decrease. So I mean, this may be relevant, this may not be relevant, but Power BI will just throw out all types of analysis to you. So you can see customer IDs. It will even do this analysis based on order IDs. Very interesting, actually. There's some orders which actually contributed a huge. So this particular order contributed a decrease of $18,000. That's a massive sales decrease, right? So that's actually a very, very high contribution for that particular order. So these are some outlier values and some very interesting insights I will get from this analysis. And of course, if you like a visual, let's say I like this analysis and I want to add it, I can just come back here and click on this small plus sign. There's a thumbs up, thumbs down sign. These are basically the users rating feedback that you're giving to Microsoft real time, based on which Microsoft will basically reorder the results, and anyone else anywhere across the world, if they're using this, that feedback actually gets reflected real time. So this is the plus sign. You can just click on the plus sign and see how this analysis will be added to the page now. And it will work just like any other visual. And this is what we call a waterfall chart. Now we're going to learn how to create this step by step now. I'm going to clear this page. That's my waterfall chart shell. So a very, very basic example of waterfall chart we're going to take now. Sales, order date, and you can see what we're getting right now. Category is basically the x-axis. That's my category. Y-axis is my values, and tooltip is just as we understand. Breakdown, I'm just going to come back later. What breakdown is that at a very basic level, this is what the waterfall chart looks like. So this is just like looking at a normal column chart, but the only difference in waterfall chart is that you're just looking at the cascading effect. You're just looking at a cumulative effect here. So 2014 is this much sales, and it's as if 2015 is stacked on top of 2014, just like you're stacking this on top of this. Just think of it like that. It becomes even more interesting when you break it up. And by the way, I'll just take profit here. Profit will be more interesting because you have negative values here. And if you just break it down further, you can see just by looking at those bar lines, you can get a very good feel of which are those quarters when the contribution of profit was the highest. So what you're looking at here is a contribution of profit to your total, very much like a stacked column chart. So you can very clearly see that Q4 2016, this particular bar is very big. So this is the highest profit. And the same information you will also get from a normal column chart, but I think the waterfall chart just kind of gives you a much more cascading effect, and it will be even more interesting if you break it down further. And now you start to see some reds. This will be very interesting. And again, the same information you will get here also, but see here, basically, if you have negative values, the columns will basically go the other way. And the waterfall chart, because it is cascading in nature, you can see how those red colors will come, and it's a negative profit. Okay, so across my entire breakdown, this is basically a negative profit, and you can very clearly see which are those months where the highest profit increases occurred, and which are those months where basically I had negative. So this is also a negative, small negative sign. Okay, actually expand it. Now, so this is the very basic cumulative view that I wanted to present right now, and obviously there's a lot more that you can do with waterfall charts, and all of these things that you can do with waterfall chart, all the analysis things that you do with waterfall charts using the breakdown feature. So up to this point, all that we know and see is the overall profits across different years, quarters, months, days, whichever level of hierarchy you're looking at. But the fundamental thing that you're measuring is the breakdown of your profit. How is your profit comparing across different years, across different quarters, across different months? That's the fundamental thing you're measuring. What if your use case is slightly different? What if now you want to further break it down region? So not only do you want to see the profits, but you want to break down by region. This is very much like your legend, but once again, unlike a stacked column chart, you're basically conveying a cascading trend. So just take a region here, and now you see this is very much like a legend, as I said, but then you can see that here again you're showing a cascading effect. So 2014, my overall profit was this much. So these bars are going to be just like a normal column chart, 14, 15, 16, 17, just like a normal column chart. And what you're showing is how that increase happened. So this is just like the normal column chart. If you take the normal trend here, see how it works out. Okay, and these stacks are basically presented as a cascading in a cascading order. But these big bars are just as you would expect. That's 14 sales, that's 15 sales, that's 16 sales, that's 17 sales. Now what you're answering, the question that you're answering here is the sales from 14 to 15 actually increased. The question that you're answering here is why it increased and how it increased on the basis of region, because you're breaking it down by region. So yes, 14 to 15 there's been an increase, we can see that, but now you're breaking it down by region and you're answering why and how it increased. And very clearly you can see that the increase majorly happened because the central region increased a lot in terms of profits, right? So you can see central region, the 14 profit was $539, whereas the 15 profit was like $11,000. And what is the change? The change is like 11,177, which is like a 2,000% increase from the last year. Okay, and remember the comparison that you're making here is with the region central. Okay, so we are breaking it down. So we can see that yes, from 15 to 16, there has been an increase in profit. We can very clearly see that, right? From 2015 to 2016, the profit has increased, the overall profit has increased. But how can that overall profit be broken down by different regions? In other words, what you're answering here is how can that increase be broken down across different regions? Okay, so whereas in a normal stacked column chart, you will look at the proportions on the basis of absolute values. So you're looking at 2016 sales as the total sales here, which is like close to $80,000. So out of $80,000, let's say central forms like 20% of the total. But the question that you're answering here is something very different. But here you're not breaking it down by the total sales. So this this doesn't signify the percentage of the total. It signifies the percentage of the difference change. It's a very, very important concept of a waterfall chart. And just to put it more visually, you can see 15 to 16, the change happened, but what you're answering is how that change happened. And in that change, very clearly from 15 to 16, you can see there's been there's a change that happened, right? From $61,000 to $81,000, roughly 30% increase happened. And out of that 30%, out of that $20,000 increase that we had, out of that $20,000, which all regions had the majority contribution? And you can very clearly see the increases. Green stands for increase and red stands for decrease. Why do I call it the cascading effect? Because very clearly you can see here, the starting point of one bar will be the ending point of the last bar. So 14 was here, 14 to 15, an increase happened. This was the first increase. This was the second increase. This was a very, very faint third increase. And the fourth decrease, again, remember the starting point of a bar is the ending point of the decrease. So it's starting from here, but it's ending here. That is why we call it cascading. Similarly, here you can see 16 to 17, an increase happened. And very clearly, you can see a lot of reds here, but those reds are very easily offset by the greens. West and East had massive increases. So again, the increase happened here. East will start from here, cascades up. The end point of East is the starting point of South, starts from here, ends here. And the end point of South is the starting point of Central, starts here. And that is my final value. Okay, it's very, very useful to convey trends in your data. And this is exactly how those automatic visuals that Microsoft Power BI generated for you when you clicked on explain the increase, explain the decrease. This is how it is. It was no magic, but it was simply the breakdown feature that was being applied. Okay, you can absolutely display this for different visuals. You can absolutely come back and display this whole thing for, let's say, category. You can absolutely do that. Now you're displaying it by category or by something else. So you can absolutely display it by any. The properties are very similar as far as we talked about before. Properties are going to be very, very similar to normal column charts, which we have talked about. Few differences, of course. The difference that you have here is one, sentiment colors, obviously. Sentiment colors is where you can check the colors, increase, decrease. These are colors you can set. And the other is a breakdown feature, the breakdown portion where you can set something called maximum breakdowns. Okay. Now, maximum breakdowns again is a very useful feature because remember the category that we are taking. Here we are taking the category of breakdown as a region. Now, previously we took something called segment. We can also take something called subcategory. So the category of breakdown, you're just telling how many categories you want to include. Very clearly, you have your maximum is 4, and very clearly the region also has 4 categories. So there's going to be no problems here. But you need to be very, very careful if you have a large number of underlying categories and the maximum breakdowns are restricted to 4, then what happens to the remaining? I think the excellent example will be if I try to break it down by subcategory. Let's take subcategory here. Remember, subcategory has 11 underlying values. If I take a subcategory, something very interesting happens. So now I'm looking at something called a yellow color. And that yellow color stands for other. Because as part of the default feature in Power BI, you cannot represent all these values together. Right? You can't show all the subcategory values. It look very congested otherwise. So you're clubbing everything else into that others bracket. And if you head over here, and if you head over to the breakdown section, you can see the max breakdown has been set to 5. So it depends on data point to data point. Depending on the type of data point, Power BI will automatically adjust. But if I make it 3, see what happens. So it will have 3 breakdowns and everything else will go to other. If I have 2, it will have 2 breakdowns, everything else will go to other. Okay, it just depends on the level of detail you want to convey. And a very useful visual overall. You can see again from 15 to 16 an increase happened. Why that increase happened, and you can see most of my increases happened because of copiers and raise. Okay, see those yellows are really coming. The yellow contributed to a huge decrease because that's the other category. Almost everything fell. Okay, so that's the max breakdown feature I wanted to clarify, and that is basically the types of colors you have: increase, decrease, other. Other might be a black color I might configure, and the total, obviously. All right, so that's about waterfall chart, guys, and pretty much covered everything about waterfall charts, and that's about ribbon charts and waterfall charts for all of you.
I'm sure you enjoyed learning from this video. Please like the video, and if you have any doubts regarding this video, please comment us in the comment section, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more such informative videos. Do look out for other related videos in our playlist. For more information, visit our website now. Keep learning with Intellipaat.